President Trump made a lot of commitments on the campaign trail around cutting government spending. He's put Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge of this effort, kind of from outside government.
There isn't a lot of discretionary spending. It has been less about simply cutting out the fat and more about becoming more efficient.
There are a lot of questions about in the market right now is the US versus the EU, and feeling like the European Union has been targeting US technology companies.
Regardless of which administration we are in, certainly I think the EU was beginning to target the hyperscalers in the Obama administration as well, and talking about digital tax in this day and age, fair share in terms of needing to pay for the use of the networks, etc., coming in on copyright, and then certainly now digital services tax. To some degree, there's a little bit of, you don't pick on my little sister, I get to pick on my little sister, right?
Good afternoon and welcome to Political Capital. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I'm the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures and the host of Political Capital. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. Today, we're going to be focusing on what President Trump's second term in office will mean for entrepreneurs and the technology sector as a whole. We're joined by Grace Coe, Vice President for Government Relations at Siena. Grace previously advised President Trump in his first term at the White House on technology and innovation policy, working across both the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. And she was later appointed to represent the United States as an ambassador for international negotiations on technology issues like global spectrum. Grace, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
More than any election season, maybe since the 2008 cycle and Google, you saw leaders from technology and venture very much at the forefront of public debate this campaign cycle. And obviously you have Trump assigning important, public priorities to entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and like Vivek Ramaswamy. And so while, maybe media is more focused on immigration or trade or some other high profile issues, it does seem like tech is going to play an important role in Trump's agenda. And so I want to use our time together to kind of learn from your experience in the first Trump administration and what you think the second Trump administration might mean for the sector. So maybe we can start with your own experience. You've had an impressive career in and out of the public and private sector, as a partner at DLA Piper, as counsel at the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce, senior roles at Nokia. How did you end up working in the Trump White House in the first place?
Yeah, I was working at the House of Representatives as Deputy Chief Counsel for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology at the Committee on Energy and Commerce. And as I think they were looking to staff up, as folks in the transition team were looking to staff up at the National Economic Council, they reached out to a mentor of mine who recommended me for the post and went through the interview process. So I came in because I was, in a way, part of the swamp already, right? Already somebody who had been working on tech policy issues.
So you had deep kind of subject matter expertise on the topics from your time on the Hill, and that was kind of what brought you in.
Right. Nobody on the Hill has deep subject matter expert. Right. We do our best, right? We have no deep subject matter expertise. But yes, I had been working on these issues. I had training as a lawyer on regulatory and telecom and tech issues, and I'd been seeing the clashes up front and, live and up front in the at the House of Representatives. So, in the past we had done hearings on all sorts of things like the sort of the rise of the over-the-top video streaming providers, to the transfer of the IANA contract to ICANN from NTIA. So just a whole wide range of these, everything from voluntary disclosure to intercarrier compensation. It's just, like I said, not an expert, but could talk semi-credibly about a number of these things.
You'd at least worked on complex matters of technology regulation at the federal level.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
Exactly, yeah.
So you were at the White House for a while, and you were at both the National Economic Council, but also dual-headed at the National Security Council.
I was never actually dual-headed. I did quite a bit of work with the National Security Council. So, I begged Everett, actually Eisenstadt, who was the then, head of the directorate on, I think, International Economics, Trade and Development. Um, but I spent a lot of time working with that crew. I did also have a clearance, which is different. Most of the time, the folks at the National Economic Council don't have clearances, but I had a clearance specifically with an eye to dealing with some spectrum questions, et cetera.
Got it. And is that how you ended up then? So you left and then you came back in this ambassadorial role. So how did that kind of come about?
We needed someone to represent us at the this treaty conference at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, that happens every 4 years. And there's always somebody designated to be the head negotiator, the head of the delegation, and that person gets the personal rank of ambassador. Um, and this person doesn't necessarily need to understand everything about spectrum, but they do need to understand the politics of spectrum, especially, the politics of spectrum or the politics of any scarce resource, right? Everybody wants it. They always need more, and they don't want anyone taking away or impinging on their use of what they have, which, makes for some very nasty conversations. So this is something that I knew the players, I knew the federal players, I knew the industrial players, and somebody who wants to actually get something done and figure out what the best approach is for ultimately serving the U.S. people, the U.S. population.
I should really then address you as ambassador.
Oh, no. We don't get to keep the rank. I think it's only folks who are confirmed who get to keep the rank. This is not a confirmed position, so yeah. I'm not
You
sure
don't
exactly
get
where the
permanent
distinction
letter.
is. Yeah. And it would just send me off into fits of giggles anyway, and we'd get nothing done. So
Well, I appreciate your service on behalf of our country.
thank you. It was scarring.
Yeah. So you're at the NEC in the first term, working on technology and innovation policy. What were some of the big priorities that you guys were focused on at that time?
I've, I will say right away, the China question had come up pretty quickly. It's one of the first things that we were thinking about right away. I will say, there were other things that came with a turnover from a Democrat administration to a Republican administration. Top of mind for a lot of people at that point was net neutrality. And certainly that, had a bit of time, it had a bit of its time in the sun, but really the White House was quite focused on competition with China, on the questions of intellectual property theft, particularly in the technology space. And
Yeah.
I think, right away, the biggest question really became 5G and deployment and development of 5G. So I spent a lot of time actually discussing with people what 5G really meant, to the next economy. That a lot of the where 5G is headed is if 4G was about broadband, bringing broadband to the mobile ecosystem and to the consumer, 5G was actually really more intended to bring, I think, not just broadband, but connectivity to things and to be able to allow things to connect to other things. And 6G should take that even to the next level, bringing, I think, even comprehensible connectivity, telemetry back to humans as well. So understanding that was going to be sort of the groundwork for AI, IoT, and automation, people quickly understood around the NSC and NEC that 5G was a technology that Western interests really needed to control. So a lot of what I was doing was focused on that.
So there was some kind of internal education around government about why 5G mattered and why it should be a priority.
Correct. I think so. I will say that when I walked into the White House, somebody asked me, "Oh, you're the tech person. Um, how do we make more spectrum?" So there's a lot of education that really needed to get done.
That's not quite how it works, really. It's sort of a law of nature situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was
It'll
tough.
make
It
more
was it
sense.
was one of those things. Yeah, I know. I know. I'm sure you encountered things like that as well. So
And in terms of the kind of competition with China and the concerns around IP, what were some of the efforts? I mean, was it about the negotiations with China? Was it about working with US companies to help them protect themselves better? Was it trying to diversify out of China to other trading partners? How did you guys think about that?
Um, I think one of the things that concerned us was the lack of authorities that the US government had to deal with the question of Chinese equipment coming into the United States. So, beyond, I think, something like IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, um, we weren't really entirely sure what sorts of authorities that the government had within the law to actually prevent some of that. We also didn't have a general strategy for encouraging industry to move forward with 5G in a way. Also, there's I think tech policy nerds who run around DC understand that in telecom you need spectrum, in telecom you need um, the incentive to deploy, et cetera. And there was no sort of governmental support on that to be able to push that forward. So we thought about what authorities we might need to keep the bad guys out, and we thought about what policies and initiatives we could put in place to allow U.S. industry to run faster. And for better or for worse, or I think that's we were somewhat successful in getting those policies across. And I think we do have additional authorities now to prevent unsafe equipment, unsafe components coming into our ICT systems. Um, I think that the recent rulemaking that came out of BIS on connected vehicles is proof that some of this will work and that this will be exercised again, not just in a Trump administration, but in administrations going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like you were ahead of the curve on the importance of that subject. I mean, it's been an enormous subject of debate in the last 4 years. So you guys were kind of early realizing we needed better controls, more tools, given the potential threats from, sort of spyware or whatever being baked into hardware that comes into the U.S.
Yeah, the Kaspersky Binding Operational Directive happened while I was there. I didn't, I was not personally involved in that. That's strictly in the NSC Cyber Directorate, but it certainly does have economic repercussions, right? Because not just government agencies were using Kaspersky, but multiple other important companies were using the same antivirus software.
So there was the kind of competition with China, IP, protecting our kind of national security interests. There was the more kind of pure telecom stuff around spectrum and 5G. Was there other work you were doing more about how does the federal government promote innovation or encourage entrepreneurship or anything in that zone?
So I was working at the NEC, which had much more of a direct. I worked much more directly on sort of speeding industry, trying to figure out how to make sure we were putting policies in place that allowed our industries to compete in probably more mainstream technologies. Michael Kratsius was the lucky one who was at OSTP, and his focus was much more on the emerging tech portfolio. That doesn't mean that I didn't get a chance to help. For example, we did our darndest to try to really start pushing forward on the framework for the use of commercial drones, for example. In order for commercial drones to be used, we do need a framework. This is an instance in which regulation can actually help us because you want to know what the rules of the
Right.
road are for for that technology to flourish. But Michael was there are multiple tech experts in the White House, as you probably remember. Actually, sometimes it's hard to know which cook is in charge, but Michael had really took the emerging tech portfolio and moved it pretty far forward. In fact, if I recall correctly, he had just a massive initiative on AI, which really I think laid the foundation for good AI policy today. And I think that includes two executive orders plus a strategy, plus I think getting the commission started. So a commission at Congress started. So he was much more involved in the emerging technology space.
Got it. Well, I guess as you look forward and kind of maybe now pivoting to what the second incoming Trump administration might mean for the tech sector, given both your work, but also just someone who pays close attention to what's happening in Washington and in the tech sector, what do you think entrepreneurs or early stage technology companies should kind of expect from the Trump administration? What might be their kind of North Star in terms of technology policy?
So, really quickly, I'm going to provide North Stars for interpreting, I think, the Trump administration. So that before we get to what the Trump administration's North Stars are, but to my mind, I think there are two things that probably matter most. And number one is what's past is present. I think we're going to see a lot of picking up where things left off, whether that's tariffs, whether that's technology. I think we're going to see a lot of that work coming back. So, in interpreting the Trump administration, going back and seeing what was done in the first administration is probably very good and very key. So to that end, I think it's really, I'm hearing that maybe Michael Kratsios comes back to work again at the White House. And he had been the CTO in the past. I think he might come back to the White House or somewhere else in the administration to help shepherd through some of the work that he's done in the past. The second North Star that I'd argue is exactly that: personnel is policy. Right. So looking at who the selections are is also super important. So if Michael Kratsios does come back, I think that's a very good sign for emerging tech and for startups. That is a very sympathetic ear, someone who is interested in knowing what is coming down the pipe when it comes to technology. So whether it's hypersonics or wireless charging, I think there's a real interest in understanding what the United States startup economy can do and what it's bringing to the party next. So that go ahead. Sorry.
No, just to recap, those are really helpful. So one, past is present. So whatever the Trump administration cared about the first time around, some of it probably got rolled back by Biden, and now it's going to come back in force. So that's a great guide. And second, the individual people who get selected, especially if they were in the first Trump administration, you probably can get a pretty clear sense of what their priorities are and what kind of stuff they care about.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, you can see, just to take a recent example, there were threats on immigration. There were threats of tariffs, basically, to contend with immigration um, on Mexico, and today that's being, picked up from yesterday's comments again. So it's
Right.
I would say if we look back on, for example, on things that were done on tech in the first administration, we should be able to see some pieces of continuity coming through there. So on some, yeah,
And then again,
go ahead.
no, in terms of North Stars for Trump 2.0, like substantively, I mean, is it you already mentioned the competition with China is a big piece. There seems to be a big kind of deregulatory push, which was also true in the first term. Are those the kinds of things we should expect to kind of focus areas for energy and policy making?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think those are two big focus areas that will guide tech policy. So I think one of the campaign promises was to rescind the current AI order and to reset the direction on AI, which I think will again go to being much more. I don't even know if much more deregulatory is necessarily the word. I'd say if you compare the AIs from the Trump administration versus the Biden administration, I think much of the principles are the same. But I think the Biden administration EO is much more prescriptive and got further and further down into detail. And I think there will be some willingness to allow for more judgment calls to be made at lower levels.
It's much more prescriptive, you said, so that they're going to, rather than trying to say the federal government says you shall do it this way, this way, this way, and not this way, this way, this way. There's going to be more let the private sector kind of work through it based on some broader guidelines or principles.
Right. With broader, I mean, I still think that there is a commitment to safety and non-discrimination. There's still a commitment to scaling our workforce that can ultimately meet the nation's AI needs in the future. But it's not going to be, and therefore you have to do, X number of programs that graduate X number of people, et cetera. So it's going to be a little less prescriptive, I think.
Yeah. And in terms of that kind of effort that's been stood up at the Department of Commerce, the National AI Institute, do you think that's going to continue on in some form, or hard to say?
That one's hard to say. My guess is that it may not. I think it will be seen as a Biden administration priority. So there will probably be something else put in place. I don't think they'll completely leave a void. Um, but that shape of that remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But again, like I said, personnel is policy.
Just given that it was created by,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that was created very much by executive order. It's not a congressional, it's not statutory. So there's a lot of flexibility for incoming administration.
Exactly, exactly. So that can be done fairly quickly. And with the rescinding, if the order is rescinded, yeah, that's probably what'll happen.
Right. So if you're an AI startup and you had been worried that there was sort of regulatory burdens on you, or you were going to, maybe the one argument was that the regulations were actually favoring the incumbents because they were better equipped to deal with regulatory standards because they had bigger teams and they could actually, afford to send a bunch of people to Washington. So, if that was your view as an emerging startup, this is actually going to work to your advantage to some extent.
Ultimately, yes. I think that this actually bodes well for larger and definitely for smaller companies. There won't be so much of a box checking exercise to make sure that what they're doing will go through and can be accepted, either for funding or for society. So I think that's the deregulatory pitch of what may be coming is actually a positive. Um, I do expect still to see concern for safety, concern for an understanding of impacts, but I don't think it will be from the front end. I think it will be more sort of actioned on the back end as people learn more about how this technology works.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe a little more personal commentary. I have to imagine for some companies, especially the bigger ones, there's going to be a little bit of whiplash. I mean, I know Anthropic invested very heavily in working with the Institute of Commerce and kind of shaping the regulations, and now it'll be kind of pushed back. So it'll take some time for readjustment in the market.
Yeah, and I'm curious from your perspective, Nate. Do you think companies will continue to do the kind of work that was prescribed by the EO? I mean, certainly states will be interested in California, for example, will continue with its AI Transparency Act, and we'll still see, I think, some attempts to do more in the way of regulating AI. And I suspect I'd be curious to know what you think that companies would probably also will continue this direction of putting some sort of a supervisory overlay on top of AI, regardless.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably companies that felt like they were investing in the regulatory standards will be frustrated, and those that were sort of waiting to see what happened will be pleasantly, surprised, and that's just how it'll go. I mean, my guess in terms of the kind of political economy of the whole thing is that other states start stepping into the void to some extent, whether it's Colorado or New York, or states that have real interest and capacity to make complex policy, and you end up with a little bit more of a quilt work, which ultimately is actually not that helpful for the sector. And so then at some point, the sector actually says, actually, we do need federal guidelines, and then Congress steps in. I mean, that's how these kinds of, and you've seen this, I'm sure, in other sectors, that's how these things go. But it takes, instead of happening in a 2-year period, it takes 10 years, and that's just sort of the nature of U.S. policy.
Right, exactly. And that's also kind of a theme that actually I think was also true of Trump 1.0 as well, is that there was a lot pushed to the states, generally speaking.
Yeah.
It's not always the best for companies, right? Because we'd rather have typically a a more sort of consistent standard, a single standard to work by. But for better or for worse, I think a lot more gets pushed to the states generally.
I mean, that's an actual philosophical difference between Democrats and Republicans, and it gets reflected across a wide range of social and technical policy matters. Is, should there be more control at the federal level or more control at the state level? And they're not necessarily thinking about it purely in terms of economic efficiency, but more from a kind of political philosophical view.
Right, right.
So, I mean, we touched on AI. That's certainly a big topic that's front of mind in terms of technology policy. The other one is competition with China. And I mean, you mentioned a part of it is around concerns about kind of protecting U.S. critical infrastructure and hardware products. Are there other kind of big policies you think are likely to move in terms of technology because of competition with China, whether that's more investments in kind of this, the chip sector, or tariffs specifically designed around the technology industry, or what else do you think might be in the works?
Oh, I think that's all of the above. I think all of that what's interesting about Trump 2.0 is that they're going to pick up where they left off, and they are better positioned to do this, right? They have people now with more expertise. They're much more prepared to hit the ground running as they come in. So certainly we can expect very quickly to see tariff actions. And I think the tariff actions right now are not particularly aimed at China. I think he's press has reported, there's been remarks about, levying 60% tariffs on China. And that one I think is less about tech perhaps, but more just about the trade imbalance. But generally speaking, I think we're going to see tariffs all the way across the board, which makes it really difficult for tech, for the larger tech companies that have established production operations, et cetera. So there'll be questions there. Certainly export controls will continue. I think export controls, I want to say that there's a stat that says something like Trump put in more export controls than any other administration had in the past. And then there's a funnier stat that says, and then the Biden administration broke that record. So I think regardless of where we are, I think that direction it continues, particularly as it comes to tech competition. And while I think Senator Rubio, who will be heading up the State Department, while state does not have control over export controls, I think it will continue to be a pretty vocal interlocutor in the interagency. So I think it matters that there are a lot of hawks that are being named to the administration. Again, going back to the notion that personalized policy. I think Lutnick is also a bit of a hawk. Yeah.
Right. Big picture, Trump is putting into office and into powerful positions people who are very skeptical of our trade relationship with China, very skeptical of China's sort of stealing of our technology, very concerned with exports, and therefore the overall posture of the administration, whether Rubio's at state doesn't directly control, it's not really the issue. Broadly speaking, they're going to be doubling down on what they did in the first term, in which Biden sustained in many ways, which is really clamping down on what kind of technology can leave our country, because it is such a central pillar of our kind of overall national security position.
I couldn't have put that better. That is absolutely, that encapsulates that really well. Absolutely. And so that's, I think we can expect to see continued export controls on technologies that enable quantum AI. I think climate, I'm sorry, just listing off the rest of these batteries, et cetera. So the trick though is that certainly China has geared up now. And it has its own toolbox of export controls and sanctions that it can now levy against the United States. So it will be interesting to see how Trump's willingness to go big on a lot of these hammers, I guess is what we can call them, how they will be met.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me, again, as someone who, has been in government at a senior level, but is now not actively involved. Historically, maybe Democrats wanted a more active government in the economy and Republicans wanted maybe a less active government in the economy. that's not really the divide anymore in my mind. I mean, both Democrats and Republicans want a pretty active role for government the economy. They're just using slightly different tools to some extent, but with a kind of maybe a similar
100%.
set of goals.
Yes. Oh my God. This is a different world that we're living in. Industrial policy is no longer a dirty phrase. It is very much it's just an entirely different world. I think we broke with the way things worked in 2016, right? I mean, I think Obama was the last president of the great globalization, and now we're in a very, very different era, I think.
Yeah,
And tech is where a lot of this is being worked out.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, sort of love Trump or hate Trump, you have to acknowledge that he shifted our posture towards China and global trade in a way that seems to be now being continued by both political parties. That's just sort of an objective historical fact.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think he wasn't the only one sort of work. I mean, we have to think about, I think, Bolsonaro came into power, Erdogan came into power. There's a whole bunch of other people who came into power at around that time that were much more sort of nationalist, isolationist, and I think
Yeah.
much more concerned about, about sovereignty and national independence as opposed to, I think, a globalist order.
Yeah, we spoke with Matt Turpin, who was the head of China in the
Yeah,
National Security Council for Trump. Great guy, and he was
yeah.
saying that his sort of colleagues who worked for the Hillary Clinton campaign had actually a quite similar set of views on China as he did, and so that the repositioning might have happened whoever had been elected in 2016.
I think that might be true, but Trump is so the president was so unique in a way. It was easier in a way for him to do this, right? I think.
Well, he didn't come in with a whole lot of baggage about where he stood on various kind of
Yeah,
international policy questions for sure.
yeah,
So we talked about AI. We talked about China. The other thing that I hear a lot of questions about in the market right now is about kind of the U.S. versus the EU, and feeling like the European Union has been, targeting, maybe unfairly targeting U.S. technology companies, and that is the Trump administration going to engage the EU in a more confrontational way around those kinds of regulations?
so yeah, that's a great question because I think it's that wonderful frenemy relationship that the U.S. has with the EU, especially in tech, because I think you're absolutely right. Regardless of which administration we are in, certainly I think the EU is beginning to target the hyperscalers in the Obama administration as well, and talking about digital tax, talking about in this day and age fair share in terms of needing to pay for the use of the networks, et cetera, coming in on copyright, and then certainly now a digital services tax. So will the American government at this point decide that they want to defend the hyperscalers, or will I think the gripes about how social media unfairly privileges, you know, liberal speech over conservative speech, will that actually affect the way I think they think about hyperscalers abroad? To some degree, there's a little bit of, you don't pick on my little sister, I get to pick on my little sister, right? So I think there's some of that that will come into play, right? Um, on the other hand, also, I think there is a recognition that the hyperscalers are also the ones building, for better or for worse, building the AI infrastructure that is going to be so critical to the next economy. So there's an understanding there
Yeah.
as well. Um, so I think those two factors make me think that there will be a more robust defense of the hyperscalers in Europe. It's not just I'm the one getting to pick on my little sister. It's not just that. I think it's also a sovereignty question as well. So or it will
Yeah.
be seen as a sovereignty question as well. I think there is just a bit of schizophrenia generally when it comes to the hyperscalers. So it's the search stop. I mean, there is a willingness on the part of this incoming Trump administration to enforce antitrust rules, to enforce, I think, the laws that are on the books that would perhaps prevent the hyperscalers from becoming larger and more influential. But at the same time, I think there is an understanding that they are also in the forefront of some of the cutting edge technologies that will propel our society into leadership. So, it's sort of a Sophie's choice kind of situation again, right?
Yeah, that was where I was going. The politics around the large tech companies are complicated for the Republican Party. On one hand, they're interested in lower corporate tax rates, maybe, or certainly generally friendly to big corporations. On the other hand, there's a sort of a political distaste for the social media companies in particular, feeling that they preference the kind of liberal, side of the political spectrum. And that's played out in these sort of interesting politics around antitrust in particular, where incoming Vice President Vance was, gestured, sort of positively towards Lena Khan at the FTC. It's hard to imagine her staying in that role, but I am curious if you think the FTC will continue on its kind of current path of, kind of a tougher stance.
Somebody will take on the role of doing more in the way of enforcement, whether that's at the FTC or at DOJ. And
Yeah.
I don't know necessarily that it will be at the FTC with its traditionally independent status. I think, incorrectly or not, DOJ may be perceived as more within the administration. So I'm not going to get too close to that topic because I don't think there's a lot that can come out of anything good that can come out of it. But generally speaking, I think that somebody will be interested in continuing to examine the potential for anti-competitive conduct in some of these very large hyperscalers.
I appreciate that. I know it's a sensitive subject, so respect your perspective there. I guess maybe last topic is around the kind of Department of Government Efficiency, which I'm not sure it's really a department, but President Trump made a lot of commitments on the campaign trail around cutting government spending. He's put Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge of this effort, kind of from outside government. And I'm hearing kind of two very different sets of interest from startups around this. One is awesome. They're going to try to cut people. That means they're going to buy a bunch of software to automate, which may or may not be true, but it isn't, is not completely implausible. Certainly AI has a big role to play when it comes to the mountains of paperwork that government by its nature has to process. So that's sort of an interesting opportunity. On the other hand, federal R&D spending is a very important part of the innovation ecosystem, and historically, at least, was one of the first things on the chopping block when you're trying to cut kind of discretionary domestic spending, non-defense domestic spending. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what impacts you might think this kind of broad government efficiency push might have on entrepreneurship and early stage tech markets.
Yeah, it's this is what I've been banging my head on too. On one level, there isn't a lot of discretionary spending to play with, right? So I'm not sure where the fat can come from necessarily. But from what I understand about the conversations that have been had about government efficiency, it has been less about simply cutting out the fat and more about becoming more efficient. So it's been traveling down much more of the areas that you've been talking about just now in terms of using AI to become more efficient, using technology to be able to provide better services. And I think the focus will probably be much more along those lines. That doesn't mean that empowerment won't be tried, right? And it doesn't mean that there won't be some effort to claw back on certain funding. I've had a lot of questions, for example, on the BEAD program, which is that massive $42.5 billion broadband subsidy that's going out there, aimed by the Biden administration primarily at fiber. And whether, Musk has called that a big waste of money, particularly when his satellites can deliver very good connectivity across the world for a lot less. And so there will be questions about whether or not there's which funding can be actually drawn back, which funding are congressmen and other people who have a say in the purse strings, which ones are they going to actually protect on a political level as well. So I think
Right.
this is going to be a bit of a mess, but I do think that if any overarching thread can be seen, I think there is going to be an interest in sort of making the government more technology modern, which, by the way, was also an initiative of the first Trump administration. If you remember the Office of American Innovation, which was led by Jared
Yes.
Kushner, that was something that they wanted to do then as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to argue the idea of government adopting software to deliver services better to American citizens. So, insofar as there's one area where you could get bipartisan support, that would be it. My guess is, and these are my words, not yours, this is going to be a source of major political and media attention, particularly because there's also a big kind of deregulatory angle to it. And my guess is the people who will do the best are lawyers with deep expertise in the Administrative Procedures Act. They're gonna have a very good
Oh,
season.
and
So
government contracting, right? There are 1,000 ways to gum up a government contract or to do all sorts of things. So um, it's really hard to change the Beltway.
yeah, yes, many have tried and failed in that effort.
Well,
Well, Grace, this was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. We really appreciate it.
thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure, and it's fun to chat through um, what might be coming.
So excellent. Bye.